Tell you what, Pops, since you clearly know so much about her, why don't you go ahead and start her up? The voice cut across the flight line like a low-flying aircraft, sharp and flat and laced with the unearned confidence of youth. Captain Derek Holt stood with his arms crossed over his flight suit, weight cocked back on one heel, chin tilted up at a precise angle that communicated everything he needed it to communicate to the ground crew, and junior officers gathered 10 feet behind him. He was 29 years old, dark-haired, broad across the shoulders, with the easy physical certainty of a man who had never once been made to feel small. He had flown 61 missions in the A-10C Thunderbolt II, had twice been named his squadron's top gun during exercises at Nellis, and had the particular brand of arrogance that grows in men who are genuinely skilled and have not yet been educated in the difference between skill and wisdom. The old man he had addressed did not move. His name was Walter Pruitt, and he was 83 years old. He wore a faded canvas work shirt the color of old mortar, tucked loosely into worn jeans that had been washed so many times the denim had gone soft as cloth. Over the shirt he wore a canvas jacket, the kind of jacket that carries history in its fibers, that smells of machine oil and high desert air and decades of use. On the lapel was a small pin, a miniature silhouette of an A-10 Warthog. No larger than a thumbnail, the metal worn smooth where a thumb had rubbed it 10,000 times. He stood at the edge of the Davis-Monthan flight line, slightly apart from the rest of the Veterans Community Tour group, his hands at his sides. Those hands were liver-spotted, map-worked with the lines of 83 years, knuckles like old river stones, and they were perfectly, absolutely still. He had been looking at the aircraft. The A-10 sat on the ramp 30 feet in front of him. Tail number 806, one of the 355th Wing's operational birds, freshly returned from a training sortie, and not yet through post-flight. In the Arizona summer heat, the flight line at Davis-Monthan was a specific kind of punishment. The concrete radiated stored heat up through the soles of boots like something alive. The air smelled of JP-8 jet fuel in a way that stopped being a smell and became a weather system, hanging over the ramp in an invisible haze that tasted faintly metallic at the back of the throat. Somewhere behind the distant hangars, a turbine was winding up, its whine rising and falling like a question asked repeatedly. The A-10s on the ramp stood in a row, massive and angular and deeply unglamorous, gray iron gargoyles, stub-winged, thick-bodied, with the GAU-8 Avenger cannon housing jutting from the nose like a declaration. They looked exactly like what they were, aircraft designed not for beauty but for the kind of work that requires endurance. Heat shimmered off the far end of the runway until it dissolved the horizon into something liquid and uncertain. Holt had noticed the old man 10 minutes ago when the tour group shuffled past the static display near the ramp access gate. The others had kept moving, taking photographs, listening to the young staff sergeant acting as docent. Walter Pruitt had stopped. He stood in front of tail number 806 with the particular stillness of someone who is not sightseeing. Holt had watched him from the maintenance coordination area, initially with casual curiosity and then with the slow accumulation of irritation that comes to men who cannot tolerate stillness they don't understand. He had made 2 comments to his wingman, Lieutenant Carver, both drawing laughter. Then he had walked over. "Hear me, old-timer?" The voice went up a notch, the kind of escalation that performs for an audience while pretending to be concerned. He raised his eyebrows and turned back toward the crew. "Maybe the hearing aid needs a fresh battery." Laughter from the group. A few of the ground crew smiled, though 2 of the more senior NCOs had gone quiet in a way that Holt did not notice. "I'm serious, sir. She's all yours. You seem to know something about her. Hop on up." He gestured toward the boarding ladder with a sweep of his arm that was a bow and a dismissal simultaneously, theatrical and complete. Walter Pruitt turned his head then. Not his whole body, just his head, slowly, the way a man moves when he has decided to acknowledge something that has not yet earned his full attention. When his eyes found Holt's, Holt felt something that he would not be able to describe later, except to say that it was like looking at the surface of a frozen lake and understanding that there was an enormous amount of cold, dark water underneath. The eyes were pale blue, the color of a winter sky an hour after sunrise, and they absorbed his posture and his grin and his crossed arms without reflecting any of it back. The recoil of the A-10 on a full burst, Walter said, is approximately equal to the combined thrust of one of the TF-34 engines. His voice was low, the kind of sound gravel makes rolling down a dry hill. A lot of pilots don't know that. I always thought they should. He turned back to the aircraft. Holt stared at him for a moment. Then he laughed, a short, sharp sound, and turned to his audience again. Well, there you go. He spread his hands. Ladies and gentlemen, we have ourselves an expert. More laughter, more assured this time. He stepped to the side of the ladder access and swept one arm out in an exaggerated courtly gesture. Chin dipped in mock ceremony, like a maître d' presenting the evening's finest table. After you, sir. She's all yours. Show us how it's done. Walter Pruitt set down the pamphlet he had been holding and walked toward the aircraft. No one laughed. The laughter simply stopped, the way a faucet stops, because something about the way the old man walked, unhurried, direct, without a single glance at Holt or the crowd, communicated something that the laughter could not survive. He reached the base of the boarding ladder. He gripped the rails. He climbed. He climbed with the economy of motion of a man who has done this 10,000 times. Not fast, not slow. One rung, and then the next, each movement deliberate and exact, without the hesitation or the careful negotiation with gravity that men his age typically exhibit on ladders. He settled into the cockpit seat. He reached up and adjusted the mirror by a fraction of a centimeter without looking at it. His hands moved to the instrument panel. He did not reach for the checklist. The hands began to move, left hand to the throttle quadrant, right hand traversing the panel in a sequence that had the quality of music, the quality of something so deeply memorized that it has passed through memory and become the body itself. He touched each switch, each guard, each button, not the way a man remembers, but the way a man breathes. The avionics master. The battery, the external power check. The sequence was correct. It was complete. It was flawless. The crew chief standing near the nose of the aircraft, a young airman who had been performing a post-flight inspection, straightened slowly without realizing he was doing it. And then the smell of the flight line vanished. It did not fade. It vanished. The JP-8 and the Arizona heat and the concrete were simply gone, replaced in a single moment by the smell of smoke and burning sand and something else. The smell of a landscape that is also a wound. The sound of the flight line dissolved into the rhythmic thump of rotor blades that were not there, the low crackle of a radio. A voice calling grid coordinates in the flat-clipped cadence of a man who is very afraid and will not say so. Walter Pruitt was 22 years old, and he was 30 feet above the desert floor south of Basra, and the ground below him was on fire. It was February 25th, 1991, Operation Desert Storm. He had been in country for 31 days and had flown 43 missions and had not yet learned to stop counting. The ground commander's voice came through the radio with the particular quality of a 9-line briefing, called in under fire. Precise, fast, slightly ragged at the edges, troops in contact, friendlies on the road, Iraqi T-72s from the northwest, danger close. Walter acknowledged, called his roll in, felt the aircraft settle into the dive. Off his left wing, in close formation, was Razor 2. Lieutenant James Digger Deal, 24 years old, from Laramie, Wyoming, who had a photograph of a brown horse taped to the dashboard of his car back at Al Jaber, and who owed Walter $20 from a card game 3 nights ago, and who had a particular laugh, high and quick, like something surprised, that Walter could pick out across a crowded mess hall. Walter rolled in on the first gun run. The aircraft shuddered the way it always shuddered, the way a living thing shudders as the targeting solution locked. He pressed the trigger. The GAU-8 fired. There is no adequate description of what it sounds like from inside the aircraft when the GAU-8 Avenger opens up. The sound that the world hears from below, that famous, terrifying burst, that 30mm ripping of the air, is not the sound the pilot hears. What the pilot hears is closer to the sound of the aircraft itself speaking, a vibration that begins in the airframe and moves through the seat and into the spine, a low grinding roar that feels like controlled violence in the way that nothing else in aviation does. The T-72 on the road below came apart. Walter pulled off, climbing, turning back to check his 6. He called Winchester on that target. Razor 2 keyed his radio, rolling in. Walter banked left to keep visual. He heard Razor 2's gun. He was watching the target area. He heard the pull-off call begin, and then stop. Not complete. Begin and stop. He turned. The sky to the left and behind him was empty. 2 miles back, at his 7 o'clock low, a column of black smoke was rising from the desert floor with the clean, terrible verticality of something that has been interrupted mid-motion. It rose into the blue Iraqi sky and bent slightly in the wind, and kept rising. Walter stared at it for 1 full second. The ground commander's voice came back on the radio. Still in contact, still calling fire. Walter turned back toward the target area. He rolled in. He pressed the trigger again. He did this 3 more times. The radio frequency that Digger Deal had been transmitting on remained open. It remained open for the rest of the mission. It made no sound. It was the loudest thing Walter Pruitt had ever heard in his life, and 41 years later it was still the loudest thing he had ever heard in his life, and he expected it would remain so. The memory released him like an open hand. He was in the cockpit of tail number 806 on the flight line at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base, Tucson, Arizona, and his hands had not paused. The startup sequence was nearly complete. The hands had continued through the flashback because they did not need him anymore to do this particular thing. Below him, the flight line had gone very quiet. Airman First Class Marcus Webb was 20 years old and 3 months out of technical training at Shepherd Air Force Base. He had been working a post-flight inspection on the adjacent aircraft when the old man had climbed the ladder, and he had stopped working because something about what he was watching would not allow him to keep working. He had no framework for it yet. He was too young and too new to have one, but the body understands certain things before the mind does. And his body understood that what was happening in that cockpit was not what it appeared to be. Webb walked away from the aircraft. He walked around the nose of the adjacent hog, out of Holt's line of sight, and he took out his personal cell phone. He called the 355th Wing Command Post. The duty officer answered on the second ring. Professional and curious, Webb told her what he was watching. He gave the name from the tour manifest he had glanced at when the group came through the gate. He gave the tail number. The silence on the other end of the line was sudden and absolute. It lasted 4 full seconds. When the duty officer's voice returned, it was a completely different voice. Same person, different register, stripped of its routine professionalism and replaced with something tighter and more careful. She asked him to confirm the name. He confirmed it. She asked him to confirm the location. He confirmed it. She said, "Do not let anyone touch him. Stay where you are." Her voice went slightly distant, as if she had half turned away from the handset, and he could hear urgent murmuring in the background before the line went dead. In the 355th Wing Command Post, Colonel Ray Stinson had been on a phone call with the logistics branch about an upcoming inspection. His aide had walked in without knocking, something she had never done in 3 years, and had said a name. Stinson had set the phone down before she finished her sentence. He had come around his desk already reaching for his service cover. He had not said where to find his car, he had simply moved. On the flight line, Holt had reassembled his composure. The laughter was gone, but he had replaced it with authority, with the institutional certainty of a man who has a rank and a position and an aircraft with his name on the scheduling board. He stood at the base of the boarding ladder with his hands on his hips and his voice raised to the tone of a direct order. "Sir, I need you to exit the aircraft. This is not a request." He looked back at the ground crew. "Someone get me a ladder. I want that man out of the cockpit." No one moved to get a ladder. He didn't notice why. He didn't look at their faces. If he had looked at the face of the crew chief, or at Airman Webb, or at Staff Sergeant Patricia Ochoa, who had been the A-10 crew chief for 9 years, and who was standing 6 feet away with her arms at her sides, and something in her expression that Holt would have recognized as reverence if he had been looking, he might have understood something earlier. He was not looking. The GE TF-34 engines began to spool. That sound begins at a register the ear almost doesn't catch, a low whistle, almost gentle, as though the machine is clearing its throat. Then it builds. It rises through registers that the chest cavity registers before the eardrum does. The 2 TF-34 GE-100 turbofan engines on an A-10 do not make a glamorous sound. They make an honest sound, the sound of serious mechanical work, of machinery that was designed for endurance rather than spectacle. It fills the space between the hangars. It moves across the ramp. Everyone on the flight line who had been in motion stopped being in motion. 300 yards away, the veterans' tour group turned as one. Captain Derek Holt stopped talking. The sound of a siren reached the flight line a moment later, distant, then building, then arriving in the form of 2 security forces vehicles and a dark blue command car that came around the south end of Hangar 3 at speed, the command car in the lead. They stopped 30 yards from the aircraft. The doors opened before the vehicles fully stopped. Colonel Ray Stinson walked out of the command car. He was 51 years old, with 3,400 hours in A-10s, and he did not rush, but the pace he set covered ground with a particular efficiency that had nothing to do with calm. His eyes found the cockpit immediately. He walked toward the aircraft. He passed Holt without looking at him. He stopped at the base of the boarding ladder and looked up at the old man in the worn canvas jacket sitting in the left seat of tail number 806. Walter Pruitt looked down at him. Something passed between them that had no language. Stinson turned. His eyes found Holt. They moved to Holt's hands, which were still on his hips. They moved back to Holt's face. Holt lowered his hands. Stinson turned back to face the aircraft. He straightened. He brought his right hand up to his service cover in the sharpest, most breathtakingly precise salute that anyone on that flight line, including a master sergeant with 22 years of service standing near the maintenance bay, including a lieutenant colonel who had flown 2 combat deployments and believed he had seen most of what the Air Force contained, had ever witnessed. His eyes were locked on the cockpit. His body was perfectly still. The salute held. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. No one spoke. The engines continued their low, honest work. At the edge of the group, someone made a sound that was not quite a gasp and not quite words, but was both things at once. Holt had gone the color of old concrete. Stinson dropped the salute. He turned to address the assembled ground crew, the officers, the members of the tour group who had drawn closer without deciding to. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "Walter James Pruitt," he said. Colonel, United States Air Force, retired. He joined the A-10 developmental test program in 1974, 2 years before most of you were born. And he flew the prototype before this aircraft had a name, before it had a doctrine, before anyone at the Pentagon was certain the Air Force even wanted it. He spent 3 years at Edwards putting this aircraft through its paces, writing the reports that determined what she could and couldn't do, arguing for the A-8 integration when there were generals who wanted to strip it out. He flew 112 combat missions in this aircraft during Desert Storm. At the time of his retirement, he had more A-10 combat flight hours than any other pilot in the history of the program. Stinson paused. The enemy had a name for him. In the radio traffic we recovered from captured Iraqi communications officers, they called him Al-Khinzir, the warthog. Because when his call sign appeared on their frequencies, the landscape changed and did not change back. He looked at Holt. The aircraft that Captain Holt suggested this man could not start. Colonel Pruitt flew the first production variant off the assembly line at Farmingdale in 1975. He has more hours in this specific airframe than this airframe has hours with anyone else. Captain Derek Holt received a letter of reprimand that was placed in his permanent record. He was removed from the flight schedule for 30 days and assigned to a mentorship program under the 355th Senior Master Sergeant. These things happened quickly, efficiently, with the matter-of-fact precision of an institution that has long experience administering the consequences of arrogance. The institution did not destroy him. It was not designed to destroy people. It was designed to correct them, and to do so in ways that last. Walter Pruitt climbed down from the aircraft. He came down the ladder the same way he had gone up, one rung and then the next, without theater. He reached the tarmac and stood for a moment beside the nose of the aircraft, one hand resting on the landing gear housing with a lightness that was not leaning and not holding on, but was simply the gesture of a man resting his hand on something he loves. Then he crossed the ramp to where Holt was standing. Holt was standing the way men stand when the ground has changed under them. Feet apart, not quite balanced, the arrogance evacuated from his posture and replaced with something younger and less sure. He looked at the old man coming toward him, and he did not know what to do with his face. He settled on something that was almost dignity and not quite there. Walter placed a hand on his shoulder, the same shoulder he had squared at the old man like a door being closed. His hand rested there with neither weight nor ceremony. "She's a hard airplane to know," Walter said. "Takes years before she shows you what she really is. Don't let your mouth run ahead of that education." He looked at the aircraft, at tail number 806, standing on the ramp in the Arizona heat, its twin engines winding down now to silence. She carried a lot of people home who had no business making it home. She deserves better than contempt from the people who fly her. That's all. That's the whole lesson. He removed his hand. He looked at Holt for one more moment, a look that contained neither anger nor warmth but only clarity, the look of a man who has seen enough of things that the relevant questions have stopped being complicated. And then he turned and walked back toward the tour group. The crowd parted for him without anyone deciding to. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning in late July, Walter Pruitt was in a corner booth at the Desert Rose Diner on Aviation Highway, 4 miles from the main gate at Davis-Monthan. He had coffee and a newspaper and the particular ease of a man who has nowhere to be and has decided to enjoy that fact. The diner was mostly empty at 10:30 in the morning. A woman with a laptop, near the window. A couple of retirees at the counter, the low murmur of a television with the sound turned down. The bell above the door sounded, and Derek Holt came in. He was in civilian clothes, jeans, a plain gray t-shirt, running shoes, and without the flight suit and the rank and the institutional context, he looked younger and somehow less assembled than he had on the flight line. The arrogance was gone from his posture the way a tide goes out, leaving the true shape of the shoreline. He was thinner, or appeared so. He moved through the diner with the careful deliberateness of a man who is doing something that costs him something and has decided to pay it anyway. He saw Walter. He crossed to the booth. He stood at the edge of it. "Colonel Pruitt," he said, "I came to apologize, not because I was told to, because I owe it to you." He did not dress it up. He did not qualify it. He named what he had done and said it had been wrong and said he was sorry. It was a short apology, and it was complete. Walter looked at him for a moment. Then he picked up the laminated menu from beside the syrup and slid it across the table. "Sit down," he said. "Coffee's good here." Holt sat. The waitress came. Outside, faint and low and unmistakable through the diner's front windows, the sound of A-10s working the Goldwater Range drifted down from the north. That honest, serious sound. The sound of aircraft that were built to absorb punishment and keep flying, to be unglamorous and enduring and present when everything else had failed. It carried all the way to the diner. Walter heard it. He folded his newspaper. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup, those liver-spotted hands with their perfect, patient stillness, and he looked out the window at the blue Arizona sky. Some of the men who built this country's legends still walk among us, quiet and unhurried, and they do not need to tell you who they are. If you were moved by Walter's story of quiet courage and timeless wisdom, hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs to see it, and be sure to subscribe to Veterans Valor for more stories of America's unassuming heroes.